Hi everybody, welcome to a recorded class. My name is Mr. Wahlberg. Today we're going to discuss Unit 2, the Empire Business, and Episode 1, Industrialization. We have 6 objectives today. That's 6 of them. You should be able to explain how the natural resources and refining methods led to intensive industrialization. You should be able to identify inventions that changed the way people lived and worked. You should be able to identify management business strategies that contributed to the success of business tycoons such as Andrew Carnegie. You should be able to explain social Darwinism and its effects on society. You should be able to summarize the emergence and growth of unions. And then you should be able to explain the violent reactions of industry and government to union strikes. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Native Americans have been making medicines from oil long before Europeans arrived, but early American settlers had really no use for it. But by the 1840s, Americans were using kerosene for lamps, and in 1859, that increased when Edwin Drake made petroleum cheap by successfully using a steam engine to drill for oil. Drake kicked off an oil boom, spreading from Ohio to Texas, and petroleum refineries turned oil into kerosene. Originally, they just burned off the gasoline. It had no commercial value to it until later it became the important part of the process, and kerosene became increasingly, I don't want to say irrelevant, but less used. Subpoint B. In 1887, prospectors discovered iron ore deposits more than 100 miles long and up to 3 miles wide up in Minnesota. The discovery of that oil deposit, or iron ore deposit, coincided with a boom in coal production, where coal production went from 33 million tons in 1870 to producing more than 250 million tons by 1900. So within the lifetime there. Now iron is a dense metal, but it's pretty fragile. And if you could remove the carbon from the iron, then you make steel. Steel is a lighter, more flexible, more durable metal. It's much easier to use and much more long-lasting. But to refine iron into steel, that was a pretty inefficient process until Henry Bessemer developed the Bessemer process, which would inject air into molten iron and then remove the impurities. By 1880, U.S. manufacturers were using this process to make around 90% of American steel. Now, that was still eventually replaced by the open hearth process of steel making, which was more efficient and could also make steel from scrap metals and a variety of other things. Subpoint C. Now that you've produced all this new steel, let's put it to work. The railroad era was coinciding at the same time with the new steel production, and at first, railroad track was the biggest use of steel. Then barbed wire, and then farm machines. It transformed the plains also with this new product. Steel building construction included the Brooklyn Bridge, built in 1883, and spanning over 1,500 feet across the East River of New York. The steel cables of the Brooklyn Bridge were supported by towers, and they were pretty impressive feats. The towers were higher than any other man-made weight-bearing structure since the Egyptian pyramids. Coinciding with this, but at the same time, steel became the frame for skyscraper construction and supported building with internal steel structures instead of outside walls. So you built like the frame skeleton inside the building and put the walls around it rather than the building being supported by the walls outside. That construction change meant the buildings could reach record heights. Roman numeral number 2. In 1878, Thomas Edison established the first research laboratory, really in the modern sense ever. In 1880, he patented the incandescent light bulb and created a system for electrical production and distribution. Electricity, it's so obvious that this is a game changer, but it's a game changer. By 1890, it was running all kinds of machines, both home and industrial. And once it was available in homes, electrical availability encouraged the invention of appliances and truly changed life. Electricity allowed manufacturers to locate power plants any place, or not power plants, but just like any manufacturer. Before this, manufacturing needed to be tied to a reliable source of energy, something like a running river or a stream. But once you could power it by electricity, then new industry could grow in new places. In 1867, Christopher Sholes invented the typewriter, which looks like a pretty cumbersome device in its early days. 9 years later, Alexander Graham Bell, this guy with the excellent beard down here, Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant Watson introduced the telephone, and that changed office work. It changed office work by making it more available, but also just easier to operate. This coincides with the increase of women into the workforce. We'll talk more about that soon. But it's around 40% of clerical workers within the first decade after the turn of the century were women, and that's a pretty fast advancing position for women to take in the work world. Inventions impacted also factory work, leading to real industrialization, because at that time, clothing factories were mechanizing as well, providing another input for women to go find jobs and truly changing the lifestyles of Americans. Industrialization made jobs easier. It also improved America's standard of living. And by 1890, within the end of the century, the increased work efficiency had a carryover to actual life, where people, the work week was decreased by about 10 hours, but the efficiency made it possible to keep wages, if not the same, at least within parity. Roman numeral number 3. I want to introduce you to a guy named Andrew Carnegie. He was born in Scotland to penniless parents. He grew up incredibly poor, and at 12 years old, he came to the United States in 1848. By the time he was 18, so by the time he was, a high school senior, but he was not a high school senior, but by the time he was 18, he worked his way into being a private secretary to a local leader in a Pennsylvania railroad, which meant he's like personal assistant to somebody who's got a pretty good pool of wealth. Now, Carnegie famously helped fix a snarled mess of passenger and freight trains where his boss allowed the young man to go buy stock in the company. The buying stock in that railroad was a big opportunity. His family didn't have any money. His mother mortgaged the house to go buy shares, and it paid off. Eventually, it made him a self-made, rags-to-riches millionaire. He entered the steel business in 1873, and by 1899, by the turn of the century, the Carnegie Steel Company made more steel. The one company made more steel than the entire country of Great Britain, which was once the greatest producer of the product. He hired talented staff. He offered company stock and promotion. Carnegie became famous for using vertical integration. He would basically buy out all of his suppliers, and he would control all the phases of steel production, from the mine to the finishing. He also used horizontal integration, which we usually associate with the different industrialists of Rockefeller, by buying out his competitors, and he eventually controlled almost the entire steel industry. From one person was almost controlling the entire industry. Roman numeral number 4. We want to take a diversion here and talk about a social movement which gets tied up into an economic movement, and it's based in the scientific principle of evolution. It's called social evolution, or more sinisterly, social Darwinism, which took the theory of biological evolution, but misapplied it. Basically, put it into a social context or an economic context. It says, well, if the best adapted animal is going to survive, what if the same thing happened in economics? That the idea of survival and success of the most capable, and they tied it up. They're like, what if just rich people were better because rich people are just better? And they, some people saw it as tied it up into some bad theology that said if a person is rich, that must mean that God likes them more, and therefore the poor people must be actually inferior and showing up in their laziness. Now, economists use social Darwinism to justify a doctrine of laissez-faire government action, which means basically the government doesn't get involved in the business techniques. Social Darwinism is really considered a discredited theory of how just economics works and money moves, but it was pretty influential in its day. Businesses were trying to control the industry with mergers along the way by buying out competitors. Buying out all the other competitors would form monopolies, which led to a total control of production, wages, and Rockefeller. And so, really, the person we most associated with this is a guy named John Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller comes up with the idea of the Trust Holding Company. He was the founder of Standard Oil and made his money in the oil business, but really made his money in developing this new business technique called a trust agreement. There was trustees where they could run separate companies, but all the separate companies could act as a single company and could essentially operate an entire industry pretty much single-handedly. That allowed Rockefeller to gain basically total control of the oil industry in America. Rockefeller is the classic example, but there are other people that are known as the robber barons. Rockefeller profited by paying low wages and underselling others. He would go in and actually take a loss in a market until he would chase out all the competitors. Once he controlled the market, then there was no competition. He raised prices from there. Critics called these industrialists, and Rockefeller's the classic example, but he's by no means the only one. The robber barons, as if the feudal lords of a baron, but ones who had taken their wealth from others. They were like barons in the feudal system, but they robbed the public to get so. Industrialists also became philanthropists. They gave large portions of their wealth to create universities, hospitals, foundations, etc. And those leaders had a flattering nickname, the captain of industry. There's sort of a classic American history question as to, you go and you find Jay Gould and you say, is this guy a robber baron or a captain of industry? And the truth is, they're all kind of both. were all kind of mixed bags. Subpoint D. Government thought that the expanding corporations would stifle free competition, so they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to say that businesses and trusts were illegal. Were illegal if they were interfering with free trade. The prosecuting these companies were pretty difficult though, because it led to the government to stop enforcing the act, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was really about trying to control unfair competition, it didn't work so very well though. It didn't have a lot of teeth to it. Subpoint E. The South was recovering from the Civil War, and it was hurt by a lack of capital. The North owned about 90% of the stock in railroads. Railroads were the most profitable Southern businesses. There's a lot of reasons why the South was not super developed in the years after the Civil War, but the biggest businesses that were there were the railroads. And the North actually owned about 90% of the stock in the railroads. And so that the wealth is held outside of the South. Southern businesses had a number of problems. There was high transportation costs. You could just clearly tell the railroads aren't as developed in the South as they are in the North. They had tariff problems to deal with and very few skilled workers because of the nature of the economics in the years after the Civil War and before the Civil War. Roman numeral 5. Northern wages were generally higher than Southern wages, and this coincided with exploitation, these unsafe working conditions. And those, the languishing wages, the unsafe working conditions, united workers across the regions. Most workers ended up working 12-hour days and 6-day work weeks. They did repetitive, dull tasks. They didn't have vacation or sick leave or injury compensation. If they got hurt, they just stayed at work. To survive, families needed all the members of the families to work, including the children. But sweatshops and tenement workshops were basically the only jobs for women and children to have. They required very few skills, they paid the lowest wages, and were sometimes the worst environments in which to work. Subpoint B. The National Labor Union then became the first large-scale national organization to try to organize workers. In 1868, the National Labor Union got Congress to give an 8-hour day to civil servants. They focused on linking together existing unions, and it was segregated, and the NLU prohibited African-American members. On the other hand, you've got the formal name is the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor. They're just known as the Knights of Labor. It was a union whose goal was to unite women and black people and unskilled workers. They also supported an 8-hour day, equal pay, and arbitration, which means that when a person has to go deal with their boss, they get a neutral third party to do so. The Knights of Labor is like the first really great big labor union that has any kind of import in the big picture. Now, craft unions were a little bit of a different model, where the National Labor Union was like a large-scale organization, and the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor was like this big union also. Craft unionism operates a little bit differently. Here they include skilled workers from one or more trades that are related to each other. And the two examples I'm going to talk about first, organized by the guy on the left, Samuel Gompers, helped found a union known as the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. It still exists today in a slightly different form, but they use collective bargaining for better wages and for hours and for working conditions. They basically said that all the workers would accept the same contract and the same work agreement. They used a number of successful strikes and won higher pay and a shorter work week. And the AFL, while it continues, they become sort of like the more moderate, workplace-friendly union that makes it easier to negotiate with the bosses, and they have a lot of success in their way. Another union I want to talk about are the industrial unions, which would include skilled and unskilled workers across an industry. And the most famous early organizer here was a guy who becomes very important in American history. We'll talk about him for a fair amount of time in this unit and others. A guy named Eugene V. Debs. Eugene Debs formed the American Railway Union and was also very effective at organizing worker strikes here. So generally, we would call both of these together, the union movements, although they're very different. The AFL is a craft union. They're sort of the moderate position. Eugene V. Debs would eventually become very, very radical and would be a very militant style union here. I also want to talk about one more before we move on to our next section, and that is the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. The IWW also have another nickname. For some reason, they're also called the Wobblies. I'm not totally sure why, but I kind of like it. Here, this union is constantly flirting with socialism. Socialism was a new to Americans philosophy, and it was very appealing to a class of workers that felt like the system was failing them. The IWW, like a lot of workers, were arguing for like government control of business and property and equal distribution of wealth, and that the government should manage all of these things. The Wobblies formed in 1905, and it was organized by radical unionists and socialists. It also included African Americans. The IWW still exists today. They're a little bit less socialist than in their past, but that's kind of what we associate the Wobblies with, was like union socialism. Roman numeral number 6. These labor unions sometimes turn to were sometimes associated with violence. We'll start with the Great Strike of 1877, which started with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O Railroad, if you're a monopoly player, went on strike to protest their second wage cut in 2 months. So here the workers are having their pay lowered, and they go on strike to protest it. The work stoppage spread to other railroad lines, and within a pretty quick amount of time, there was a snarled up strike, but on all kinds of railroads, stopping freight and passenger traffic for 50,000 track miles for an entire week. The governors of the states said that the strike was impeding interstate commerce, which was probably true, and so they called for the federal government to go intervene and break up the strike, which was done so with federal troops, basically like soldiers coming in to force the strike workers either to disperse or go back to work. Subpoint B. That was in 1877, and encouraged by that strike, 3,000 protesters gathered in Chicago at a place known as the Haymarket Square. Now here, they saw that the B&O Railroad strikers were able to get a lot of public appeal and a lot of public sentiment and a widespread strike, and they said, if we can go appeal to people for our needs in the railroads, maybe we could do it for other things. And in Chicago, a group of people gathered together to protest police brutality. Now, the protest was successful, and it was actually a tense but peaceful kind of moment. However, nervous policemen were circling around them. Policemen that feel like they're being called out, so they're like circling around this protest, and it's a nervous time. They basically show up to try to break up the protest and get it to disperse, and that sparked the violence. Then the ensuing violence, 8 people were charged, convicted, and ultimately executed for inciting the riot. And the Haymarket Affair is known as one of these like moments where social unrest is turning violent in reaction to the police. Subpoint C. In 1892, the Carnegie Steelworkers also went on strike over pay cuts. Now, Carnegie owns the entire steel industry, so if you're a steel mill worker, there's basically nobody to work for besides Carnegie, and he's now dropping pay cuts onto his workers. So the workers go on strike. The company president was a guy named Henry Frick, and he hired armed guards from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were a detective agency, but they're also operate like bodyguards and hired thugs, more or less. And he hired the Pinkertons to go intimidate the strikers. And then he hires scabs, people who were not members of the union, to go take the jobs of the protesters. It basically says, if the protesters, if our employees are going to go walk off, then I will go hire scabs and go replace them who are not members of the union, and we'll just kind of go in their place. So, and the strikers, they'll chase them out because the Pinkertons are going to chase them out. The striking mob attacked the Pinkertons. They killed 3 guards and 9 workers, and they eventually end up with such a fight that they forced the National Guard to come in and protect the strikers from the Pinkertons from beating the snot out of them, and to try to reopen the Carnegie steel plant. The strike was ultimately a failure. It continued for a few months, but the power of the union was broken, and Frick in the Homestead strike broke the union, and basically steelworkers didn't remobilize and didn't like advocately protest or anything for another 45 years after that. The Pullman strike, you remember Pullman? That's the city in Illinois which was making the Pullman cars. That's the Pullman car company. Pullman laid off 3,000 workers. He cut wages, but he didn't change any rents. And he also owns the entire city, so he's the only person that you can rent from. And so really puts people in quite a bind, and it prompted workers to go on strike also. Pullman refused arbitration. He basically said, we're not going with a neutral third party. This is my company. This is my town. I'll do it the way the way I'm going to do it. And violence ensued out of that. Basically, it caused a riot there. So one of the organizers here was our friend Eugene V. Debs, who was organizing this strike. Remember, he's a railroad organizer, and it got him thrown in jail. Most of the workers were fired, and a lot of them were blacklisted, basically told that they were unhirable by anybody in the railroad business and anybody who would go and listen to Pullman. Now, while we're talking about labor, we also need to talk about the condition of women in labor, and that's jobs, not childbirth. But women were barred from a lot of unions, and so women united basically not in labor union models, but behind strong women leadership. And I want to point out a couple of them here first. The first we'll talk about is Mary Harris Jones. She's known as Mother Jones. She was a prominent organizer in women's labor. She worked for the United Mine Workers, and in 1903, she led the Children's March to expose the reality of child labor. She's an advocate for women at work, but also children and bad working conditions. The second person I'd like you to meet is Pauline Newman. She was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers and led the 1909 uprising of 20,000, which was basically a protest of women seamstresses for better working conditions. This gets really mobilized in 1911. Well, I hope to talk about this more in the future, when a building known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So shirtwaists was a type of clothing, like a short, narrow shirt when people wore high-waisted skirts. So that's the shirtwaist. And this was a factory that was making these. It was really unsafe working conditions. Basically, garment factories at the time were almost explosive with the just sort of like cloth dust that's around and the humming machines, and they're really hot to put a lot of people in the same room. In the Triangle case, they also stored things in the emergency exits and the fire exits, and in 1911, the building caught fire, and it spread really quickly through the machines of the day, the piles of cloth. There was no sprinkler systems. The exit doors were locked and blocked, and 146 people died in tragedy. They were almost entirely women, and it was a terrible tragedy that highlighted the bad conditions of urban industry, and in particular for women in the field. So we find here that, while employers hated unions and were using the Sherman Antitrust Act against them, there was a lot of pressure to try to organize, but there also were, legal limitations which were hurting union membership. And so, laws that are coming down, but still membership rose because there was people that felt like they were organizing for better jobs, but also truly for their livelihood. All right, this is where we'll stop today. You may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you. Remember to like and subscribe.